Hi everybody, I want to welcome you back to the Hi Gatsby studio. I'm Miss Beth and I've got a question for you today. What do a button-up shirt, a squirrel, a 2-inch paintbrush, and an afro have in common? Well, if you said Bob Ross, you are exactly right, and have I got a story for you. A little over 70 years ago, a little boy was born in Daytona Beach, Florida, to Mr. and Mrs. Ross. They named him Robert Ross, but they called him Bob. Now, we don't know much about Bob Ross's childhood. We do know a few things. One is that when he was still just a little boy, they moved to Orlando, and that's where he grew up. We know that he loved little animals. He was always collecting and nurturing little animals, especially animals that were injured and needed his help. We know that he didn't really like school very much. So much so that when he was going into the 9th grade, he decided to just drop out of school and go to work for his father, who was a carpenter. A carpenter is someone who builds things out of wood, like houses or furniture. He worked very hard as a carpenter. He learned what a hard day's work was all about. And he also learned to be careful because something bad kind of happened to him when he was helping his dad. He was cutting some wood and his hand slipped into the bandsaw and it cut off the tip of his left index finger. Oh, I bet that hurt so bad, I can't even imagine. When Bob turned 18, he decided he would go into the military and he joined the Air Force. So after he went to boot camp, they sent him to his very first base in Alaska. Oh my goodness, what is a Florida boy going to do in Alaska? Probably freeze. All that snow and all those mountains and especially those cold temperatures. But Bob made the best of it. He loved the landscape and the scenery that he was exposed to in Alaska. Now, while he was in the Air Force, he began to climb the ranks and he became a master sergeant. Now, that's the guy who does a lot of yelling. And Bob Ross will tell you, at that time in his life, he had to be very mean and very tough. He was the one always yelling at the soldiers to make up their beds. And why are you late? Give me 50 push-ups. And hey, soldier, you have got to go clean the latrines. That's the toilets. He was very, very rough. In fact, they had a nickname for him called Bust 'em Up Bobby. He decided that once he got out of the Air Force, he would never, ever raise his voice again. One night, when he was flipping through the channels of the TV, he came across a painting show. It was called The Magic of Oil Painting, and it was put on by a guy named Bill Alexander. He watched the show, and he thought, I'd like to try to do that. Kind of take his mind off being a sergeant. And so he began to practice painting along with this TV show. And he began to get very, very good at it. This guy, Bill Alexander, could do a whole painting in about 30 minutes. And Bob would follow along with him. And so he could produce a painting in about 30 minutes. Often during his lunch break, he would go home and he would do a quick painting and take it back to base with him. When his coworkers saw the painting, they loved it. They would buy his little paintings that he would do during his lunch break. And the reason they loved him is because they were of the landscape of Alaska, the mountains with snow on them, the trees, the lakes, the ponds, the waterfalls. They loved the scenery. He even began to paint these Alaskan landscapes on copper gold mining pans, the pans that the miners would use to sift for the gold. He would paint right onto that pan and then sell them to the tourists in Alaska. After some time, he realized that he was making as much, if not more money, selling his artwork than he was being in the Air Force. And so after 20 years of being a soldier, he retired so that he could give 100% to his painting. He decided to move back to Florida. You see, Bill Alexander, the guy who had the TV show that he would watch, had an office, had a studio in Florida. And he got in touch with him. And he said, "Do you mind if I come and study under you? I love your technique." And Bill Alexander welcomed him into the studio and taught him everything that he knew. Bill liked Bob Ross so much that he hired Bob. And he allowed him to go around the country teaching Bill Alexander's techniques and selling different paints and brushes and books for Mr. Alexander. Well, I'm going to stop this story for a second, and I'm going to start another story, something that's very different. So hang on. During this time, while Bob is working for Bill Alexander in Florida, there was a lady, a mom. Her name was Annette Kowalski. Annette had just gone through a very rough time in her life. Her son had been killed in a car wreck, and she was so sad. She was depressed. She didn't want to do anything. Her husband, Walt, tried to help her, tried to cheer her up, but he saw that she was really struggling. One thing that Annette liked to do was to paint, but she didn't even want to do that. Her husband, Walt, got an idea. He saw that the Bill Alexander studio in Florida was having a seminar, a 5-day painting seminar. He bought her a ticket to the seminar and an airplane ticket. He said, "Annette, I want you to go and spend 5 days painting. I know how much you like Mr. Alexander. I want you just to enjoy that, and maybe, just maybe, it'll help you feel better." She was kind of reluctant. She really didn't even want to leave her house, but she decided to go and do it. He'd been so nice to buy her the tickets and all. She shows up in Florida at the Bill Alexander studio. She sits down, and in walks the teacher. But it wasn't Bill Alexander. It was this other guy. It was one of his students. Oh, she was so disappointed. She had been looking so forward to studying under Bill Alexander. Who is this guy teaching them anyway? She thought about leaving the class, but her husband convinced her to stay and just try and enjoy herself. And as the days progressed, she began to like this new teacher more and more and more. Do you know who that new teacher was? It was Bob Ross. She loved the way he taught. She loved his encouraging words. She loved that he had a very soft and soothing voice. She thought he was one of the best teachers she had ever met. And so when the 5 days ended, she called her husband and she said, "Walt, you need to fly to Florida. We got to talk to this teacher, Bob Ross." They met for dinner, and they told Bob that they thought he was fabulous and that he could probably have his own line of paints and brushes, that he could do his own teaching under his own name, not as a student of Bill Alexander. What do you think Bob felt about that? He loved it. Oh, it made him feel so great. And so they started a partnership where Annette Kowalski was his manager. She got to work immediately. She began to find malls and civic centers for him to go in and teach people how to paint in these quick brushstrokes. It only takes 30 minutes to make an entire painting. He began to travel all over the country as she would set up these appointments for him. It was very expensive for Bob to go all over the country teaching these art lessons. They were on a very tight budget. And so Bob decided that one way he would save money was not to get his hair cut very often. How could he manage that? Well, he could cut it himself, but he didn't trust himself for that. So he went to the store and he bought this box that was for a permanent. That means it made his hair super, super curly. And with curly hair, it meant that he would not have to cut it as often. And that was going to save money. He went home and he gave himself this perm. And when it was done, he had the biggest afro you've ever seen. But he kept it because he knew it was going to save money. Well, Annette continued to work to try to get Bob venues and places to teach and to meet people and to have new students. She decided it would be a good investment maybe to make a commercial about his teaching and where he would be teaching next. They did that, and so more people began to show up at the malls and the civic centers to take art lessons. She decided one day maybe it would be a good idea to video him giving one of these art lessons. Once they finished the video, she realized, this is pretty good. Maybe we could get a television station to show these videos. Instead of him teaching at all these different places, maybe he could just teach like Bill Alexander did and just show it on TV. They took one of the videos to PBS, Public Broadcasting Service, and they asked if they would be interested in showing another painting course. Well, PBS looked at it and they loved it. Not only did they love the picture that Bob Ross painted, but they loved him. He was such a humble, nice, sweet, kind man. He was encouraging to the people watching. It was almost as if he was only teaching to one person, the person that was watching the show on television. They began to make many, many episodes with Bob Ross, and suddenly people began to recognize him. They began to love watching his art shows on TV. He thought about going back to his straight hair, but people began to recognize him as this artist with this great big fro. And so he kept that fro for the rest of his life. PBS decided to name the show The Joy of Painting, and people fell in love with it. They not only loved the scenes, the mountains and the rivers and the creeks and the waterfalls that Bob would paint, but they loved Bob also. They agreed with the PBS executives that his calm and kind manner was something that they enjoyed watching. They liked his soothing voice. It was almost mesmerizing. And they did a survey. They found out that 90% of all the people that watched his show did not paint along with him. They just enjoyed watching him. They enjoyed hearing his voice. They enjoyed some of the quirky, funny things that he would say while he was painting. Those sayings have also made him quite famous. Sayings like,
"Don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents. The excess." And beat the devil out of it. And let's paint several little happy trees.
Something that I thought was interesting was that PBS never paid Annette, nor did they pay Bob Ross for these shows. But Bob and Annette were able to market or sell their products, paints and brushes and how to paint books all over the country. Because people recognized him on PBS, they began to make quite a bit of money selling Bob Ross products. The Joy of Painting ran for 11 years, from 1983 to 1994. But Bob started noticing that he was getting weaker. He was getting tired. And he went to the doctor in 1994, and he found out that he had cancer. He had lymphoma. And as the year went by, he got weaker and weaker and weaker, and he could no longer film the show. In 1995, he died from cancer at the age of 52. It was a very sad time. People had grown to love Bob Ross. Annette continued to try to sell Bob Ross products, his paints and his brushes. The episodes were sometimes on PBS, but even that was starting to fade. Annette did all she could to try to keep the name of Bob Ross alive and to continue to make some money from his fabulous teaching techniques. It wasn't until about a decade later when a streaming TV station called Twitch got the rights to show the Bob Ross episodes. And they did an 8-day marathon where they showed episode after episode after episode. The younger generation, teenagers, began to watch the Twitch streaming of Bob Ross. and he went viral. They loved watching him. Again, they weren't painting along with him, but they loved the same thing that their parents had loved. His soft voice, his kind demeanor, his gentleness, his encouragement, and the fact that he was so much fun to watch while he painted. Suddenly, the stores were packed with all kinds of Bob Ross craziness. Things like Bob Ross t-shirts and Bob Ross socks. There's a Bob Ross toaster. And maybe you've seen the Bob Ross chia pet, where the grass grows out of his head and looks like a big afro. You'll see Bob Ross plushes. And you can still find in some of the art stores Bob Ross products like paints and brushes and how to draw, how to paint books. Believe it or not, I have a Bob Ross bobblehead. Let me show it to you. Here's Bob Ross, and it comes with a little easel with one of his paintings on it. It even gives you several other little paintings you could put on the easel. One thing I love about this bobblehead is when he bobbles and bobbles and bobbles for a very, very long time. You see his afro, his beard. You see him wearing a button-up shirt with his trademark blue jeans and belt, what he always wore in order to save some money. You see his palette in his hand. But there's some other things on this bobblehead that don't necessarily go in an art studio. At least it wouldn't go in my art studio, but apparently in Bob Ross's art studio, it was just fine. Do you see these other things? Yeah, there's a raccoon, a little squirrel, and even a bird that's made a nest in Bob Ross's hair. Remember me telling you that as a little boy, he loved to collect animals and help them out, nurture them, and bring them back to health if they were injured or left homeless? Well, as an adult, he loved those same things. He was always trying to help animals that had been abandoned or injured. You'll see here that he's holding a little baby raccoon that he nurtured back to health, and a fawn. And here he's holding a baby bird that probably had fallen out of the nest. I want you to look closer at that one. Can you see his index finger? Yeah, the one that's shorter than the rest, that's the one that got cut off when he was a teenager. And then there's this little squirrel, a little squirrel that he named Peapod. Peapod sometimes would join him in the studio and would nestle down in his pocket while Bob petted him or fed him a bottle when he was little. Artist, teacher Bob Ross was one of a kind. Not only was he wonderful at teaching us how to paint in the joy of painting, but he taught us about kindness and gentleness, persistence and courage, and he taught us about beauty. I grew up watching Bob Ross. I enjoyed watching him paint, but the more I've learned about Bob Ross the man, the more I admire him. Now, I want you to tune back in this week as we do some really fun, kind of quirky activities that centers around Bob Ross. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for wanting to learn more about Bob Ross. And remember to stay safe and stay healthy.